Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 89, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. Here we are in the first week of August, and I'm starting to get excited because summer is almost over. I know that sounds like a weird thing to be excited about, but my sewing time goes way down during the summer, and things get nuts because summer is so short here in Montana that everybody tries to cram everything into 3 months. And the schedule just goes nuts. And I have a garden on top of it. So it's been a very busy couple of months. And I'm ready for things to slow down and to be able to spend more time in my sewing room. I have actually been able to sew quite a bit over the last 2 weeks, only because I know that there's this lull at the end of July every year when all the garden stuff the garden has been put in, everything's just growing, but the nuttiness of harvesting hasn't started yet. I picked my first cucumber last week, so I took advantage of these 2 weeks and I did several things. I think I talked a little bit in last week's episode about spending some time at the store learning the Bernina 990 so that I can teach the mastery classes, and I also made some store samples, and I started working on a dress because I have a friend whose name is also Janet. She listens to the podcast, so I'm going to give her a shout out here. She's the class coordinator at the quilt store where I teach, and depending on who's in the conversation, one or the other of us will be referred to as the other Janet. But she sent me an email last week and asked if I had any recommendations for a good pullover dress pattern for the summer. And it got me to thinking that I've been wanting to make the Amarena dress from Liesl & Co. And I had actually traced out that dress pattern after I bought it, probably 6 months ago. So it was ready to go. And I thought, I just need to make a muslin of it and see what I think. But little did I know that making a muslin of that dress was going to lead to a puzzle that occupied my brain for the better part of this past week. And that's going to be the topic of today's podcast. Even if you don't sew garments, perhaps this story will resonate with you in some other facet of your life. And if you have experienced the frustration of trying to fit a pattern, hopefully this will give you some encouragement. So I need to start with a little context and background information. I started making clothes for myself maybe 5 years ago because I just got sick and tired of pants that didn't come up far enough and shirts that didn't come down far enough. And nobody wants to see my stretch marks. This has been a problem for me for most of my life, but it seems to have gotten much worse in the last 20 years or so. And I just got tired of it. And I thought, I've got a sewing machine, I've got a serger, I just need to start making my own clothing. And I started with knits because knits are fairly forgiving. The fitting doesn't have to be quite as on point because knits stretch. So I made myself a lot of knit t-shirts. I made a lot of knit pants, knit cardigans. I still have a lot of those and wear them regularly. But I got to the point where I wanted to start experimenting with woven fabrics. I took a class from Joe Vecchiarelli at Sew Expo 3 years ago and made a bodice sloper. I took Kenneth King's trouser drafting class last October. I'm trying to take classes where I'm acquiring some of this information, but I will tell you right up front that my education is incomplete. So I've been kicking around making some woven top patterns for about the last, 18 months or so, with varied success. One of my problems is that I have a full bust. My high bust measurement is 38 inches. My full bust measurement is 43 inches, and there's a 5-inch difference there. So that, I think, puts me in a DD cup in sewing patterns. And having that bodice sloper has been helpful, but I also have a broad upper back. My shoulders are fairly wide, and I've always had a problem of garments fitting too tightly across the shoulders. I'm taller than average. The average sewing pattern is drafted for a woman who is 5 foot 5 inches tall. I am 5 foot 7 inches tall, and it's not a huge difference, but it's enough to be an issue sometimes, especially because most of my height is concentrated in my torso. I have a longer torso than normal, and I also have most of that length in between my natural waist and my crotch. And now you can probably understand why I hate low-rise pants. And if that weren't enough, I have a high hip rise. So the widest part of my hips is not 9 inches below my waist as it is in the quote-unquote average woman. It's only about 4 to 5 inches below my waist. So if you look at me, what my figure shape is called sometimes is the figure 8 or a spoon, because my waist nips in and then almost immediately goes out to my hips. And so my sister, when I was growing up, used to tell me that if I wore a dress with a belt, I looked like a sausage tied in the middle. And I don't think of any of these characteristics as flaws. I like to call them figure features. When I'm talking in class about trying to fit garments, I always tell people they aren't figure flaws, they're figure features. And we just have to figure out how to make those features as flattering as possible. So I know, for example, that peplums make me look really weird and unbalanced, so I don't wear peplums. I also know that tunic length tops are better for my proportions. I don't wear dresses that stop above the knee because that's not the right length for me. I've just learned after years and years and years of trying on clothing and looking at how things fit on my body to choose those garments that I am most comfortable in and that I find most flattering to my body type. So, having said all that, I had narrowed in on a woven top pattern-ish that fit for the most part. The darts were the right size. They were in the right location. The point of the dart ended where it was supposed to on my bust. It was very flattering. I could move in the top. And I thought, like Mary Poppins, enough is as good as it gets, and I was satisfied. I was supposed to teach a class on the Love Notions cadence top. It actually got canceled. I didn't teach it, but I did make a sample for the store using that pattern. And sometimes when I make store samples, I make them in my size just because I want to see what the fit is like. Sometimes I make them in a size, 8 or 10 just to save on fabric. This particular top I made in my size. I go back and forth with Love Notions patterns. I don't use them very often because they seem to be too short on me, and I usually end up having to do a lot of lengthening. But I made this pattern and I used the full bust option, which I don't always do because full bust sometimes gets interpreted as you have a large bust, but it's not a big difference between your high bust and your full bust measurement. So let's say your high bust measurement is 43 inches and your full bust measurement is 45 inches. That's not a full bust. You don't need a full bust adjustment for that size because there's only 2 inches difference between your high bust and your full bust. So when I make Love Notions patterns, sometimes I have to experiment and make the standard version and the full bust version. This is just something that I've learned to do. And they're not the only pattern company that I have to do that with. But I made that top and I put it on and I thought, oh my goodness, This fits so well in my shoulders and across my back. I was really pleasantly surprised at how well there was no binding. I could move around. And one of the really spectacular things about that pattern, I think, is the sleeves are put in flat. They're not, even though there's a sleeve cap, they're not set in like standard sleeves. They're set in more like a sleeve on a knitted garment. And the first time I saw that, I thought, oh, this is never going to work. But I followed the directions and the sleeves went in perfectly and they fit beautifully. So I took that cadence pattern and I Franken patterned it with a new look pattern that had the darts in it that fit me, that I really liked. And I used the upper part of the cadence top and the lower part of the new look bodice and kind of mashed them together. I do that a lot. And I created what I started referring to as my perfect woven tee pattern. And I took 4 of those tops to Bernina University with me and wore a different one each day. I've made 2 out of rayon batiks. I've made 2 out of Kaffe Fassett widebacks, cotton sateen. I drafted a round neck version. I drafted a V-neck version. I Franken patterned the V-neck from a Berta pattern onto that one because the V-neck from the Berta pattern was not plunging. It was very modest and I liked the way it fit, so I just moved it over to my woven tee pattern. I've made long sleeve versions. I've made short sleeve versions. It's just been a great pattern. So when it came time to get out the Amarena dress pattern, I thought I'm going to compare it to my woven tee pattern and see if I need to make any changes. That's very instructive to me. I like being able to see things laid out on my cutting table. And when I overlaid my woven tee pattern over the Amarena dress pattern, I realized a couple of things. And the first one was that I would probably have to widen the shoulders on the Amarena dress. And the second was that I was going to have to adjust the position of the bust dart. And I thought rather than do those changes, make those changes, why don't I just use the top of my woven tee pattern and Franken pattern it with the bottom half of the Amarena dress? The Amarena dress has a V-neck, but it's a very low V-neck, and I knew that it was going to be an issue for me. So I used the woven tee bodice that had the V-neck from the Berta pattern that I had Franken patterned. You see where this is all going? And made myself what I thought was a variation or a version of the Amarena dress that was sized to fit me, even before I cut out the muslin. So I thought that I was ahead of the game because I had done all of this groundwork before I even got around to cutting any fabric. And I have some red Brussels washer linen from Robert Kaufman that I think is going to be perfect for this dress when I get around to making it. And we're not done with the story yet. But I didn't want to cut into it without making a muslin. So I got out some old sheets. I keep a stack of sheets from the thrift store, and that's what I use when I need to make a quick and dirty muslin. So I ran up a muslin using my customized dress pattern, and I put it on, and I went to look in the mirror in the bathroom, and oh my, I failed. Now it's 5 days later, and I know exactly what happened, but it took me 5 days to find the answer to this problem. So I'll describe it to you. When I looked in the mirror, what happened was the top of the dress fit beautifully. It fit perfectly above my bust. The bust darts were exactly where I needed them to be. I thought they were the correct size. But underneath my bust, there were diagonal drag lines going toward the side seams. When I see drag lines or wrinkles in something that I've made, the first place I go is to my Jan Minot book, which I got from the Sewing and Design School in Tacoma, Washington. And if you go to the website, you can order that book as a PDF, as a digital download. I ordered it as a download, and I took it to the local blueprint store where I get all of my patterns printed, and they made me a printed and bound version of it. There's one for tops, and there's one for skirts and trousers. And one of the most useful features of that book is that it has wrinkle charts. So there are very simple line drawings that show wrinkles in various places on the garment with a suggestion about what the cause might be and how to fix it. So I flipped through the wrinkle charts until I found an illustration that looked like what I was seeing with this dress. And it said, the front is too short compared to the back, or the front may be the correct length, but the back may be too long. And I thought, okay, but it doesn't really tell me how to fix that. So I went to the Sewing Pattern Review website and looked in one of their forums about this issue, and there was a long discussion. And the consensus seemed to be that if one was experiencing this issue, now I didn't ask this question directly myself, I was reading other people's experiences, but the consensus seemed to be that if one saw these kinds of wrinkles, it meant that the sides of the dress needed to come up, and in order to make that happen, you needed to make the dart intake bigger. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd because the darts on my top are perfect. They're literally perfect. They couldn't fit me any better than they do. So I went to my shelf of fitting books, and I've got Sarah Veblen's book. It's called The Complete Photo Guide to Perfect Fitting. And if you do any garment sewing, I would suggest getting this book. Having those photographs is huge. So I started flipping through the book, and Sarah shows how she fit someone who had those same drag lines on a top. And Sarah suggests unpinning or undoing the seam at the armpit to below the bust dart, and then remaking the bust dart in essence, and making it, taking in more fabric into the bust dart to make those drag lines disappear. And I thought, okay, well, Sarah Veblen says that this is how you do it, and the people on the internet say that this is how you do it. So I started monkeying around with the dart intake on my pattern and on my muslins. And all I succeeded in doing was making the bust larger on my muslins. I even experimented with making two darts, one above the other, on each side instead of just a single dart, even though I really had to hunt for the information on how to do that. And there is a tutorial, and I'll link that in the show notes in case anybody's wondering how to do that particular technique. But none of that helped. I tried shortening the seam on one side. That didn't help. I tried everything that I could think of to pull up the sides of the garment and make those drag lines disappear. If I stood in front of the mirror and I pinched the fabric underneath my armpits, I could make the drag lines disappear. And lo and behold, when I did that, suddenly it looked like an A-line dress, like on the front of the Amarena pattern package. But when I let go of that excess fabric, the front of the dress would kind of fall forward, and then it wouldn't look like an A-line anymore. When I put on my muslin, I didn't have any gaping at the arm side. That's another problem that full-busted women often have, is that there's a gap in the arm side, and I didn't have that. I thought the arm side and the sleeve from the Cadence top fit very well. But as part of making that dart larger, I slashed one leg of the dart and folded up a tuck in the armscye and then refitted the bodice at the level of the bust dart. I'm visualizing all of this in my head, which is why it's not coming out quite as smoothly as I'd like it to, but I hope that you're getting the idea. And when I made that tuck in the armscye, it pulled the side of the dress up a little bit. It also made the armhole a lot tighter, which was not necessarily comfortable. And I thought, well, now I'm going to have to monkey around with adjusting the armscye and redrafting the sleeve cap. And do I really want to do that? And I was on probably my third muslin at that point. So I thought, you know what? This is not helping. What I need to do is I need to go back to the beginning and start with the original pattern piece. And don't ever throw out your original pattern pieces because you may need them. I date and number all of my traced versions so that I know if I have to go back, I can find the version that I want to work from. So I went back to my original perfect woven tee pattern. That's what I'm calling it. I went back to that original bodice for all the tops that I've been making and wearing all summer. I looked at the Jan Minot book again, and I looked and saw where it said that the length of the front or the back might need to be adjusted, but it only gave directions for lengthening it equally across the bodice, and I thought that all that's going to get me is a longer version of what I've got now. I'm missing some critical piece of information. And here's a little bit of serendipity. Sometimes the universe knows what I need before I need it. I'm in the process of cleaning out our basement. I'm trying to take some loads of unused items to the thrift stores in town, and the basement is on my list of places that needed good cleaning. And while I was down there cleaning, I came across a book called Concepts of Fit, an individualized approach to pattern design by Benita Farmer and Lois Gottwals. And I remember buying this book when I was still knitting and designing knit sweaters, and somehow it had gotten stuck away in the basement. I don't know why, but I started flipping through it and looking at the advice on lengthening bodices, and there was a lovely illustration and an explanatory paragraph about how to lengthen the center front or the center back of a bodice. And I thought, that's it. That's it right there. The issue I'm having isn't that I need to pull up the fabric at the sides of the garment, although that's one way to fix it. My issue is that I needed more length in the center of the garment to go over my boobage. And I probably didn't notice this problem with my woven tee pattern because the front of that woven tee pattern is rounded and it's a little lower than the back. So when it's on my body, it's hanging straight. But the issue became apparent when I had a dress on with much more fabric that didn't reach as far as it needed to. And that was what was causing the drag lines. I figured that out at about 5:30 last night, and I just couldn't bring myself to deal with it anymore. So I traced off a fresh version of my dress pattern that I had cobbled together from my existing bodice pattern with the skirt of the Amarena dress. And you might be thinking, well, maybe Janet didn't cobble those together properly. I think I did. I've done it enough times that I'm pretty sure that I know what I'm doing. I match up grain lines and seam lines and things like that. But I think that this is just a problem that is inherent to my body shape and needs a fix. So this morning when I got up, I went to my sewing room and I put on the last muslin that I made, which fit me reasonably well, but I had taken that gap in the armscye and closed it up, and the armholes got really tight at that point, and I thought that's not the right fix either. But I put that dress on and I made a horizontal slash across the front of it just below the bust darts, and I let it hang down, and lo and behold, the drag lines disappeared. And this is one of the things that I think people find so frustrating about fitting is that you look at a problem and the problem might have several solutions, but you don't know which solution it's going to be that's going to fix the problem. And I went on a detour because everybody said the sides of your garment are hanging down too far. You need to take a larger dart intake. Well, yeah, that on the surface makes a lot of sense. But that wasn't actually the fix that I needed. What I needed to do was make the center front of the dress longer, not the sides shorter. So I went back to my cleanly traced pattern and I found the spot just below the bust darts where I needed to cut across and hinge at the seam line the pattern so that I could put in a wedge, basically, making the front longer while maintaining the length of the side seam, because I didn't want to make it longer all the way across. I wanted to make it longer only in the front. So I added an extra inch of length at the front, tapering to nothing at the side seams, and I straightened out the grain line, I straightened out the seams, and I cut a new version, and I ran up another muslin, and I put it on, and lo and behold, the drag lines were gone. And I stood there looking at that dress in the mirror, and I thought, that was such an obvious fix. Why didn't I see it at the beginning? I got detoured into thinking that I needed to address the sides of the garment when I needed to address the center of it. Just a little sidebar here. I was at the quilt store yesterday and I was talking to the other Janet because she's there on Thursdays, and we were talking about some of my classes, and when we got finished talking about the class stuff, she said, "Do you think you could meet me here at the store to help me with a dress?" And I started laughing and I said, "You need to go read my blog, because after you read my blog, you may not want me to help you with your dress." She got a couple of style arc patterns that she wants to try making into a dress using some of the rayon batiks from the store. And I thought, I'm probably not the person to advise you, but we could fumble through it together. But then I have to remind myself that sometimes going through the process is really important. If I had just jumped to lengthening the center front, would I have learned as much about fitting as I did this past week? Maybe not. I got the experience of knowing what things work and what things don't. So as soon as I finish recording this episode, I'm going to go back up to my sewing room and I'm going to make myself one final muslin, because I want to make sure that I have dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and made every adjustment that I need to make before I cut into the Brussels washer linen. I want to emphasize that none of this is in any way, shape, or form the fault of the designer. Liesl Gibson has absolutely no responsibility to know that Janet Szabo needs an additional inch of length in the front of her garment. Every designer designs to a different set of measurements, a different block. It's why the ready-to-wear that I usually buy is always from the Liz Claiborne department, because for some reason, those clothes fit me better than anything else out there. But now I know to watch out for this in other patterns, and if I have the same issue, I can jump to the correct fix without having to go through 4 muslins to get there. I think that's enough on that topic. I hope that some of that resonated with you or made you feel a little better about your own fitting journey. I always tell people that if you can't be a good example, be a horrible warning. So maybe I was a horrible warning for you this week. Okay, I'm going to be traveling for a few days, so I am not sure there's going to be a podcast next week. I'd like to say that there will be, but I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So if there's a podcast, it might be a surprise. If there's a particular topic you'd like me to cover, let me know. I'm always looking for good podcast ideas. I welcome feedback. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. You can use the fan mail feature. You can leave a comment on the show notes page. There's lots of ways to get in touch with me, and I always like hearing from you. You can leave a rating or a review at Apple Podcasts. I really appreciate that. Those help other people to find the podcast. As always, the show notes can be found on the podcast website at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com with links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website, as well as links to my blog where you can see photos of what I've been working on. And if you want to read about this fitting saga and see some of the photos that I took along the way, then that's the place to check out. I'm off to make my, hopefully, final muslin before I sew up a dress for myself. So until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.